Hello. Hey, I just got back from work. Um, we're gonna have a little bit of fun this evening. Um, I'm gonna get into who benefits from wars and pandemics, and then I'm gonna string us along um, second law of thermodynamics and move on from there. And hey, if you're hungry for a hamburger, like a bacon ultimate cheeseburger at Burger King, prepare to spend close to $10. And if you are hungry for the combo, burger, fries, and a drink, prepare to spend close to $17. Bon appetit. All right. So, who benefits from pandemics? Pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Okay, companies that make the vaccines, antivirals, and testing systems and related products can see enormous revenue increases. Pfizer, Moderna, and biotech generated billions from the COVID vaccine sales. Okay, technology companies. Um, Amazon, Microsoft, and Zoom video communications benefited from the increased speed, from the increased demand, from the increased demand. Cloud computing and online services gained long-term users. Large corporations and financial reserves benefited from pandemics, including especially the COVID. Many small businesses were badly damaged, though. What does it say about the American dream? By lockdowns and reduced demand. Larger corporations, they benefited, and they had more cash, and they had access to credit and the ability to adapt. Okay. Investors. Investors profited from the rising stocks in technology, pharmaceuticals, logistics, and healthcare. Others lost money. Okay, chances are, you lost money, but the corporations and the investors didn't. Some investors probably lost, but maybe because they're dumb investors. I don't know. Um, Governments and institutions. Governments gained expanded emergency powers, increased budgets, and the ability to implement large scale programs. Public health agencies gained resources and visibility. Groups that generally lose: small businesses, especially restaurants, retail, entertainment, low income workers who could not work remotely, workers in industries shut down by restrictions, people who lost health, income, or family members. A broader systems view, okay, will give us how systems, perspective, pandemics act as disruptions. This is from a systems perspective. So the pandemics act as disruptions that accelerate change. Now keep that word in mind, change. Existing systems are stressed and new arrangements emerge. Remember that. You have change, existing systems are stressed, compromised, and new systems emerge. So we have more digital work, more automation, more concentration of wealth in some sectors, greater government involvement in economies. Okay. So, how about some numbers regarding the COVID-19? Pfizer and biotech, roughly 37 billion in revenue in 2022, after about 36 billion, something like that, in 2021. Pfizer's total revenue jumped from about 41 billion in 2020 to over 81 billion, which is basically double. in 2021 because of the COVID. So Moderna, before COVID, Moderna had minimal product revenue. Boo hoo. In 2021, it generated about 18.5 billion in total revenue, almost entirely driven by COVID vaccine. So its net income reached about 12 billion in 2021. Novavax COVID vaccine development transferred it from a small biotech into a major vaccine player, though later, demand sort of declined, of course. Amazon and online commerce. So revenue 2019 about 280.5 billion. 2020 about 386 billion. That's an increase of 105 billion in 1 year. Amazon hired roughly 170,000 workers during the early pandemic surge. That's not a lot of workers when you think about how big Amazon is. Bezos' wealth increased dramatically during 2020 as Amazon stock surged. So if you're investing in Amazon stock, thank you. Technology and remote work companies, Zoom Video Communications. Fiscal 2020, about 622 mil. Fiscal 2021, about 2.65 bill, increase over 300%. I like percents, like, wow, that's 300% increase. Its stock prices rose roughly $70 at the start of 2020 and over 500 at its peak. Wow. So basically, like, think about, like, if people can know, like, wow, this pandemic is gonna hit, and then you buy into these stocks in these companies, and then the pandemic hits, man, you're in the money, right? Just thinking out loud. That's what I like to do here, is totally think, uh, and think and think and think. Okay. In the cloud community, so you have cloud computing. You have like Microsoft, Amazon Web Services, and Google benefited. Yeah, Google, the Gulf of America, Google accelerated benefited from accelerated migration online. Amazon reported AWS sales rising from 35 billion in 2019 to 45 billion in 2020. And these are from different sources, okay? Sometimes I don't name the sources, but that's how this works. And billionaires and wealth concentration. According to wealth analysis during the pandemic, U.S. billionaires collectively gained hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth during the pandemic. U.S. billionaires collectively gained hundreds of billions of dollars in wealth during the pandemic because of rising stock, because of rising stock, because of rising stock. How did you do during the pandemic? Industries that benefited indirectly: medical supply companies, masks, gloves, testing equipment, shipping and logistics, home improvement, people staying home, streaming services, video games, food delivery platforms. Okay. Those are like more like, pish posh, so that's basically what's going on. So, but the thing is, millions of small businesses closed. Hospitality, tourism, restaurants, and many workers lost income. Now, to be fair, the governments had to spend on emergency programs, so that kind of, that's out the door for them. But you got to remember, though, people in government, they have diversified stock portfolios, so then it goes right back. That's my belief. Okay, and Elizabeth Warren, she invests in Pfizer. I think I know that for a fact. So, you work for the government. Government spends money to help people out. It's never enough, but then their stocks, are replenishing their incomes. Anyways, their personal income is not damaged. So remember that. Now the government suffers if it's helping you, and that you're suffering double time because like if you got rid of all of the income tax that you pay in, it would really cripple the government. It's kind of like if you got rid of all the illegals, it would cripple our economy. There's kind of a similarity there, right? Yeah, there is. Wow. So like who benefits? The big boys benefit, and the little ones don't. Basically, that's that for that. Okay, now we moseyed on to the topic of who benefits from war. So what we're going to have are people like people who manufacture weapons. And you've heard some of these names before, right? There's a little bit of overlap in my videos, but anyways. Okay, Lockheed Martin, you know what they make. These are all weapons people. Lockheed Martin, RTX Corporation, Northrop Grumman, and so on and so forth. Because during periods of increased military spending, these companies can see larger government contracts, higher revenues, rising stock prices. An example would be defense spending. It rose, roughly like 800 to 900 plus billion per year in recent years, creating a large market for military suppliers and investors, which we'll see soon enough. Energy. You're using me up. Energy. Okay, energy companies. Wars can disrupt oil and gas supplies, causing price increases. Oil and gas producers in countries that continue exporting. So this is where other people can benefit. Companies with access to new markets when competitors are disrupted. So like the Russia-Ukraine war caused major energy price volatility, benefiting some non-Russian energy producers while hurting consumers through higher fuel and heating costs. So again, whether it's in the United States or abroad, the people who push the money that pushes the product, um, they win out. All right, they benefit from all this disaster. But people who make the product, like the worker ants, and the people who have to rely on said products, we, us, you, uh, don't benefit pretty much at all. Investors and financial institutions. So you have defense sector investors, commodity traders, companies involved in reconstruction, investors buying distressed assets, contractors and reconstruction companies. After wars, rebuilding can involve billions and trillions of dollars. That's going to make some trillionaires. Hey, infrastructure, repair, housing, transportation, energy systems. Companies involved in engineering, construction, logistics, and security can benefit. Now, remember, if you work any of these jobs, like you're an engineer or something like that, you get your stipend, but I don't care. I still think that chances are you're in debt, and that's why I'm trying to get a lot more people to watch these videos. If anything, just to correct my mistakes. So let's say you're an engineer in some company, like one of these companies. Are you having to pay a mortgage on your house? And I'm not talking, and yeah, you're paying bills for electricity and all that. I'm not talking about that. Are you paying a mortgage for your house, or do you rent? Okay. Companies involved in engineering, construction, logistics, and securities can benefit. Governments and political sectors, governments definitely can benefit, and we already talked about that a little bit. It's a little bit give and take. Um, uh, and so now this is with war. So And so some industries indirectly benefit. Wars can increase demands for shipping, cybersecurity, surveillance technology, raw materials, metals and minerals, and manufacturing. Now, an example of like the worker ant. So for minerals, like who extracts the minerals? Gimli the dwarf and his buddies are down there in the mines. And so you're not making a lot of money, and chances are, if you work in these if you're mining these things, you're probably in a third world country. All right. I hope that like I make like 100 of these videos, and then people actually faithful enough to watch them all. You can kind of see, wow, this guy actually has some kind of a message that's like the mono myth, like separate mythologies, and then the mind's gonna be like the mono myth, the mono message, the mono myth, which will like crystallize, like this glowing ball of silver, and it's like, and each one's gonna have one of these over your head, and we're all gonna know what the f to do. That'd be nice, wouldn't it? Wouldn't that be nice? Uh, what to do? What to do? What to do? Oh, this is nice. So like war will take lives, destroy infrastructure, and create debt and civilians displaced. Yeah, but is didn't Jesse Ventura say something about these people in the White House now? Why aren't their kids fighting in these wars? You look at Donald Trump's um, nepotism nest, you know, of his brood, and they're not serving in the military at all, at all, at all. So the fact that some people profit from war um, should make you wonder, you know, about things, and I know that there's something called systems theory, and we could talk about that. But we're talking about people who have a lot and who are, smarter than a lot of us. And so, you know how chess works, you're able to anticipate the next move. And I totally suck at chess, man. But some of these people are probably like, they're playing the chess game of life. And so come on, you know that you can see into the future if you think like them and benefit. I mean, come on, man. I just, okay. If we recall the Afghanistan war, 2001 to 2021, which, by the way, surpasses the time we were at, in Vietnam, it creates a large financial flow. And some companies and individuals benefited significantly. The biggest beneficiaries were not usually individual soldiers. Oh, you don't say. The biggest beneficiaries were not individual soldiers, but the contractors, the logistic firms, the security companies, and the Joker's coming out just about now, and some Afghan war-related businesses that probably originate from the U.S. Yes, the biggest numbers. U.S. military contractors, about 108 billion in Afghanistan contracts. Are you enjoying that hamburger yet? That cheeseburger? At least you got some bacon in that, huh? Yeah, enjoy that. Enjoy that. Like a good doggy. Enjoy it. A Brown University costs of war study found that the U.S. Department of Defense awarded about 108 billion in contracts specifically for work performed in Afghanistan. from the fiscal year 2002 to the fiscal year 2022. This does not include all weapons, aircraft, and equipment produced in the U.S. for that war. I'm going to start pulling out the Bernie Sanders card. The largest Afghanistan contract recipients included Flora Corporation at $13.5 billion, DynCorp at $8.3 billion, KBR at $3.6 billion, Raytheon at $2.1 billion, Lockheed Martin at $2 billion, okay, and then $1.3 billion for L3 Harris Technologies. And that's from the Weston Institute. So some of the sources I should mention, but yeah, there's a lot of different sources. The broader Pentagon, I can't really sound like Bernie Sanders. I'm trying, but I'm failing miserably. The broader Pentagon spending system, the entire post 9/11 war effort, Afghanistan plus related operations involved trillions of dollars. You buy a lot of lily pads with trillions of dollars. Hey, Miss Piggy? All right. Brown University researchers estimate that Pentagon spending since the start of the Afghanistan war exceeded 14 trillion, with roughly 1/3 to 1/2 going to military contractors, not for you. Private security companies providing armed security base protection, training, logistics, transportation, earn billions, not millions, billions. Some contractors paid employees extremely high salaries, so if you're one of those salaries, kudos to you. If you're one of those highly, high salary recipients, kudos to you. Cuckoo. I wonder if your house is still, I wonder if you still have a mortgage floating over your head. I don't know. Okay. You also have Afghanistan elites and corruption networks. And I have to go over all of those. And I don't want to throw in any tin hat, stories right here, but I kind of I can't help but think that, like, behind the scenes, somehow these elites share their bed with our elites. But I could be wrong. Another theory is that if there are only elites, they'd be after each other's throats. And so in the meantime, their elites are happy with our elites being happy. And so that's, think about it. Their elites are benefiting from this stuff, and our elites are benefiting from this stuff. That's probably all I should have said, So, you have reconstruction contracts, security contracts, foreign aid, and government projects. Okay, I have to look into that further. Like, who are these entities? These Afghanistan officials? Who are they? There's so some Afghan officials, contractors, and power brokers accumulated significant wealth. The Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, SIGAR, documented extensive waste, fraud, and corruption. Now think about that. Is it only going to be on their side, though? You know what I mean? Is it only going to be on their side? So I'm glad I mentioned that. So weapons manufacturers, companies selling aircraft, missiles, drones, vehicles, and ammunition benefited from the broader military buildup, which is obvious. Okay. So basically, we're talking 2+ trillion. By many estimates, when including the operations, veterans care, interest, and other costs. The financial beneficiaries were basically defense contractors, logistics firms, private security companies, some investors and executives. You think about it, think about this comparison. So you have the war generated billions in contracts for companies, but the costs were spread across taxpayers, debt, soldiers, and also think about the Afghanistan civilians. Okay, so we have that. And pretty much all the people that I mentioned for the other war, the Afghanistan war, except for the people in Afghanistan. Okay, that's pretty much all I got to say for that. I collected some names of individual people who are making a lot of money from this because of their diversified portfolio, and they invest in the shares of the companies that I mentioned. Okay, yeah. So Warren Buffett, that guy's making a lot of money off this stuff. All right, we're calling 100 billion, and so Berkshire owns a broad portfolio, and so we're talking like a broad ass portfolio, and that's all you got to know, like energy and industrial companies and stuff like that. Okay, Larry Fink, around 1 billion, getting BlackRock manages roughly 10 trillion in assets. So I don't want to get into all those details, but like Larry Fink, he's getting a lot of money from this. He's worth 1 billion. His net worth is estimated around 1 billion, which doesn't sound like a lot, but he does have portfolio, and so portfolio is dipping into this well. Okay. And BlackRock funds are among the largest shareholders of major defense companies. So the Vanguard leadership, people who work and control Vanguard, and they're benefiting a lot of money. Yeah, I don't want to spend too much money on the numbers, too much time on the numbers. You know that they're making a lot of money. Defense company executives, and so you've heard these names before. The CEO of Lockheed Martin, the CEO of RTX. I won't mention their names. Let's just breeze through this because I want to make my points. CEO of Northrop Grumman, and we're talking like compensation often 20 million plus annually. Okay, and their wealth uh, uh, when their wealth really rises when defense stocks rise. So defense stocks is rising. You invest in these stocks, you're making a lot of money. And all these people, including politicians, including Trump's, horde of, the nepotism nest, horde. They are those wasps are. Come on, man. Um, so let's move on. Well, well, well. Speak of the fat bee himself, or the fat wasp with the head of a, I don't want to. Okay, let's just move on. Donald Trump. So he invests in Lockheed Martin, and the approximate value is, we're talking millions. Okay, um, RTX Raytheon reported in ranges up to millions. Okay, Donald Trump, Northrop Grumman, millions. Boeing reported in ranges up to billions, all millions, and so on and so on. Energy companies, Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, and all that, and petroleum and all that. He's making a lot of money off that too because he has stocks in these companies. And I think you remember another video. I kind of overlapped in this subject here. Um, yeah, so he owns stocks in all those companies that are making a lot of money from this war in Iran, but it's not publicly you know it's not publicly disclosed. So we don't know what that is. It doesn't mean it's not there. Thank you very much. You're probably wondering why I'm not going to talk about the Ukraine war. Well, think about the pattern. It's kind of like a quiz. Who's benefiting from the Ukraine war on the American side. You know, so let's just move on to the next subject. I want to get into the second law of thermodynamics, and so this deals with entropy. And so this is basically you're measuring disorder from the number of possible arrangements of energy and matter. So also you can think like heat cools, and so energy, highly packed, concentrated amount of energy, and I would even submit order for other subjects for other things. Um, is via the second law of thermodynamics going to become disorder. Okay, and so um, you have energy spreads out, heat flows from hotter areas to cooler areas. The energy becomes more dispersed. It is harder to use. It's harder to use or to do work. So this okay, and this is where some of us get distracted. But I'm just gonna walk us through it. So you have like a hot cup of coffee, and it cools down. The heat energy will spread into the room, and so the coffee in the room reach the same temperature. That's called equilibrium, thermal equilibrium, I think. The total energy is still there, but it is less concentrated and less available. So that's like, and that part refers to the first law of thermodynamics. You can't like annihilate energy. You can just make it change, and so that's why this is important. So the thing is, the second law of thermodynamics does not say that order can never arise. And now this is very important because I'm going to tell you right now, if you think that, when you have the second law of thermodynamics taking place, you can never get order in a different form, shape, size, or whatever, guess what? You and I would not be over here talking about this stuff. And there would not be any doggies or kitties or butterflies or birdies or fishies, okay, or anything that we can even consider life. So, local pockets of order will form or can form, okay? So, like, a nice experiment, like if you teach and you want to play with science, you can deal with water and snowflakes and crystals. So you have water molecules. So when water vapor in a cloud cools, water molecules will lose energy. Their movement will slow. They arrange themselves into an organized crystal structure, and snowflakes form. So you can play with that. Take the water and make it into snowflakes. I don't know. So the overall entropy of the universe still increases because the heat released during the crystallization spreads into the environment. The local increase in order is paid for by a larger increase of disorder outside the system. So you're always having disorder, disorder, disorder. Remember that. So the price for order is a lot of disorder as we are moving one direction in time. And so ever since the Big Bang, it's been like this chaos, right? It's like boom, but from that you have pockets of new order. I mean, our galaxies, right, and all the stuff in our galaxies, and including our sun and us. So a living organism, example of life on Earth would be a living organism is highly organized. You have DNA cells, organs, and ecosystems. You see, these are new forms of order from the second law of thermodynamics. You see how that is? This is something I really want to unpack this after we talked about, you know, people and institutions benefiting from pandemics and wars. Now, some of you smarter people, can you see a connection here, or am I just shooting, um, you know, um, at the sky? So like life maintains this order by using energy from the sun. The sun, what is the sun doing? It is dying every millisecond because it's expenditure of its energy. Eventually the sun will die, no? And so that's the second law of thermodynamics happening right there. So the sun provides concentrated energy. You have plants capturing light, they convert it into chemical energy, and they build complex molecules. So Earth receives low entropy energy from the sun and releases higher entropy heat back into space. The energy flow allows local organization while the total entropy of the larger system increases. And so it's pretty neat, right? Let's look at the hurricane. So this is another example of what we're talking about. So a hurricane, you have warm ocean water provides concentrated energy. Heat moves from the ocean to the cooler atmosphere. As energy disperses, a hurricane forms a highly organized structure, rotating winds, rain bands, pressure systems. Okay, the hurricane eventually will then dissipate and energy spreads out. So the order that's being created is the shape of the hurricane and the activity thereof. Pretty neat, right? So what's the paradox here? The second law of thermodynamics, the second law says the universe tends towards energy being spent, energy dispersal. But that way, okay. So the second law, I'm confusing myself here. So basically, the second law of thermodynamics, okay, that says that the universe trends toward energy dispersal, but that very flow of energy can create islands of order. And we are islands of order. So I guess, I guess that Simon and Garfunkel, song, no man is an island. Well, no, we are an island, man. So order can emerge from disorder when energy flows through a system. Now, how does this connect with, what I am talking about, like politically, talking about people benefiting from disasters? And I submit that if we are just, so much more nature. Like this thing here, it looks like it's man-made, but the material comes from nature. And we are also products of nature. And you're an island, of organized stuff. Well, and I would say that eating a chicken is an example of, second law of thermodynamics. That sense of order is being lost, and it's resurrecting into you. I wish there's a connection there, how all this works, and so now we can see how when you have like war and the existing order that was there and it's geopolitical and you have like borders and stuff like that. This goes back to the Middle Ages, and so you have a war, and then so that the order is then disrupted, and then now you have a new king, you have a new order, and you might, now now you've taken Ukraine, so you create a whole new sense of order, and all these things follow from that. Another example I would say, of how the second law of thermodynamics works in terms of order. How you see how I'm going to the, from the natural biological world to the geopolitical man's world. It's a man's world. I think it's all connected, and that's where I'm going with this. Okay, so think about like what happened to the Native Americans here. The real Americans. When Europe came over here, Europeans came here. That's like so the existing way of doing things, and it was very egalitarian. Okay, very egalitarian. No centralized government, pretty much. I mean, sure, in Central America, Mesoamerica, there you have like those empires. The Aztec and the Incans. I totally get that. And what's really funny is they're the most like kind of destructive. If you watch Apocalypto, you kind of see what I mean. There's like Indians being enslaved by Indians, and it's kind of grody. It's just like, yeah, but look who's doing the enslavement. Who's doing this? Who's doing all that stuff? It's the big like, more of a hierarchical type, society influencing, its hand over the more agrarian, right? And so Europe, then you have the Europeans come over and it's like, hey, guess what? We have a stronger hierarchical system than you, Aztecs or your Incans or Mayans. So does it just all see how I work, how my mind works? and I and for my whole life, I've never seen anybody there's another word I can share with you. It's called bisociation, and it's by Arthur Kessler. And that word, I think he coined that um, that that term. And I read him when I was in college, and I think I did some kind of bisociation thing here. I think. Uh, so um, let us hopefully conclude this soon. Now I'm gonna take us into a little bit of history here regarding the Dulles brothers. It's spelled Dulles. And so you have John and Ellen Dulles. So we're talking like 18. They were born like 1888, and they died 1959 and 1893, and dying in 1969. And so that's John Dulles and then Ellen Dulles. So let's look at John Dulles. Now he was a U.S. Secretary of State under Eisenhower in the 50s, and he was the major architect of the Cold War foreign policy. He promoted the strategy of massive retaliation. That's like in quotes. Uh, the idea that the U.S. would respond to communist expansion with overwhelming force, disruption, force. You see, when you start thinking about the forces of nature and the forces that you see being exerted in an example of the second law of, and it's like, and then where we use force, and so a communist expansion with overwhelming force against it, including nuclear weapons. He helped create and strengthen the alliance, such as CETO, and worked closely with NATO. Okay, now Alan Dulles, I'm saying Dulles, Dulles, was the first civilian director of the CIA from like 1953 to 1961. That's like 2 years before I was born. Previously worked as a lawyer. You have a lot of lawyers in government, right? A lot of lawyers. Like Jacques Fresco's like, yeah, but they don't know like the tensile strength of metal, and they don't know anything about anything that really matters. When you really think about it, I really maybe someday will really just push his idea of the Venus Project. Uh, Previously worked as a lawyer. We already said that. Intelligence officer during World War II with the Office of Strategic Services. That's the OSS. Now, the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, precedes the CIA. It's a predecessor of the CIA. Now, here's the thing that I'm going to tell you that's important. The OSS worked with the mafia, and we're talking all the mafia families coming together, and they started working with the OSS. Okay, that's something to look into later. I start getting into that. That's another rabbit hole that we can get into. Later. So under this guy's leadership, the CIA carried out covert operations around the world, including the 1953 overthrow of the Iran. This goes right back to Iran, people. Now, what's happening with us in Iran? You see, does it just blow your mind? And so, the 1953 overthrow of Iran's prime minister, which I mentioned before, Mossadegh. Okay, Mohammed Mossadegh, and that's called Operation Ajax. And just to include that, the British, the UK, they were also involved in this. So it's us and them doing this. The 1954 overthrow of Guatemala's government. So covert efforts against communist movements during the Cold War. And it's like, why is that controversial? Well, come on, we know why it's controversial. So you totally get it. So so this is like expanding U.S. Covert intervention abroad. So this is like enabling coups against foreign government, which I had mentioned before. And this also contributes long-term instability in some regions. Boy, doesn't that kind of sound like the second law of thermodynamics in a way? You got to create disorder to create a new sense of order, and that order is going to trickle upwards. Right? I mean, it's mind blowing. So these brothers were part of a powerful Washington establishment network, and their family background was influential, very influential. Their grandfather was a Presbyterian missionary, and their uncle was a Secretary of State. And their uncle was the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. I mentioned that for some historian buffs here. Uh, they became symbols of the Cold War era's close ties with between diplomacy, intelligence, business, and government power. And there's that thing about that religious folks, the religion. All right, Presbyterian missionary. You can't be spreading the word of Jesus without um, any kind of military. You know, everyone just shows up with just their the shirt on their backs and see how far that goes. And also see how far that goes without any second law of thermodynamics helping you. And so we could go into this further, but you could see how these two brothers are like right at the heart of how. And I say our. I always go back. It's our elites and our billionaires. They're running the show. And if not directly, indirectly. And uh, I know I kind of sound like a you know I don't know a curmudgeon here, but I mean, look how we were able to see the connection. Regarding these two brothers, I want to also get into the Vietnam connection. So Dulles brothers, they might not have started the Vietnam War, of course not. But their policies. It's their policies that helped shape the environment that led to a deeper U.S. involvement. So after France lost control of Indochina in 1954, Vietnam was divided into Communist North Vietnam and anti-Communist South Vietnam. The U.S. supported South Vietnam because leaders feared a communist victory. The CIA became deeply involved in South Vietnam's politics, including support for um, 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 it's I can't pronounce his name. It's Diem, uh, Diem, his government, CIA, because which was versus North Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh, who I can't pronounce Ho Chi Minh. CIA documents describe efforts to help Diem, Diem build an anti-communist state after the Geneva Accords. The logic was the domino theory. So if Vietnam became communist, neighboring countries might follow. Which for someone like me is I don't care. You know, and I think that I think the average person would not really care if their prices didn't always go up and if they were living such a precarious lifestyle. I think that a lot of us anti-communism here, it's very much because of the brainwash. I really do think that because when you're like a 5-year old, you're a child. You can play with somebody that has that's of a different skin color, and they believe in a different they don't even believe in any gods unless you get them while they're young, and like children, yeah, sometimes children can be little boogers and they pull each other's hair, but I mean, it's like we don't really think about this stuff. This is the stuff that stinky, smelly adults do, you know, and I'm one of them, and I'm just I don't cause this stuff, but I am an adult, and I sometimes think that I do stink. But anyways, like they saw the problem is that the U.S. often saw Vietnam primarily as a Cold War chessboard. So the Vietnamese nationalism and anti-colonial feelings were underestimated. I mean, they kicked our ass. The Vietnamese have ways of doing things like we couldn't understand it. And then so and then here's the thing, like I that's why I look at the Middle East. I look at that. So Vietnam is a desert. Vietnam is a jungle, right? It's all green, but like now you have the desert. Now, what makes things warm is they're closer to what's called the equator, and I submit that Vietnam is a little bit closer to the equator than, like, say, you know, Europe or, like, North America. So it's a little bit more warm and sticky and stuff like that. But with the Middle East, it's even closer to the equator, so that's why it's a lot hotter. It's a desert. It is a desert. Okay. Um, and so I look at the Middle East as like a desert Vietnam, and um, it's like, how did we fare in the Afghanistan war? Weren't we there for 20 effing years? 20 years. America, the new Rome, the most powerfulest military, the most sophisticated of weapons manufacturing and soldiering. And we were over there as the David, or we were over there as the Goliath. Okay, so Goliath is over there trying to, pop around, you know, with their little boom booms or the big boom booms, and it took them 20 years, to to reach their objective, if that's indeed what they did. Uh, and so it's just it's and now where are we now? Where are we now? The Joker's gonna come out. Now we are fighting Iran. We're fighting Iran. I think that might be our, desert Vietnam. I think we already had a desert Vietnam with Afghanistan. This is the second desert of Vietnam, and this is, if you study like how certain civilizations or empires fall, it's because of over expenditure, with wars, that you wage abroad, and I think that happened to Rome, more or less. No, so, and like, yeah, like 58, 58,000 U.S. deaths, soldiers, millions of Vietnamese deaths, and the massive bombing campaigns. So, and yeah. Oh, I know. Hey, let's see who benefited from the Vietnam War, and then we'll close this video. We'll end this video. So, okay, Vietnam War. So now, technically, it started in 1955, not because we were there. Our involvement there was not since 1955. It was much later. So we're talking about, France being over there, and then us. So just to make that straight. So, like, so who benefits? Well, so you have like groups and individuals benefiting, but it does not mean that they caused the war. Oh no, you know. Um, Defense contractors, again, just like the other, two war examples. And so, like, Lockheed, it was called Lockheed Corporation then, Boeing, Dow Chemical Company, and major suppliers, and ammunition, aircraft, electronic firms, and vehicle, oil, that's going to benefit military institutions, security institutions, so, I mean, you have the Pentagon budgets, military personnel, intelligence operations, defense research. Okay. Um, so the U.S. defense. Now the money is going to sound. Well, actually, this is kind of a lot though. Like, this is the 1960s. The U.S. defense budget grew dramatically. Early 1960s, it was roughly 50 billion a year. The peak Vietnam War, it went over 80 billion a year. Remember, that's back then. All right, so are we spending less or more? Okay, we're spending more. Hey, here's a question: how many billionaires and millionaires were there, in the 60s or 70s? Now, how many millionaires and billionaires are now in the United States? How many of you are in debt how many of you are poor and not seeing any kind of an increase in your wages, especially if you're working minimum wage jobs, and how many of you are renting versus owning, and so none of you are capitalists. Okay, you're workers, you're proletariat, like your comrades, you're workers, you know, and it's the people that I'm mentioning here that are benefiting from this. And you know what? All the people who benefit from the wars and the pandemics, they're the capitalists. Pause intended. So political figures and institutions. So politicians had gained and they increased their influence, national prominence, power through the anti-communist platform. You know, goes back to the Dulles brothers, right? Okay. So the war also tied to the Cold War doctrine of containment, the belief that stopping communism is essential to U.S. security. Now, do you think that that's still going on, or is that completely gone? You know, think about what's going on with Russia and and so now you wonder why North Korea is completely communist. So now you know why Rocket Man has those nukes. Don't you think that him and his intelligence know who the Dulles brothers were? So think about that. If I know about the Dulles brothers, they have to know. Intelligence, that's what intelligence is all about. So yeah, communists have intelligence. They have an intelligence team. And so they know all this. Fascinating. So South Vietnamese elites and connected businesses, they definitely benefited. Okay. So the broader economic effects, the U.S. industries, manufacturing, shipping, logistics, engineering. Now here's who loses: the soldiers, the civilians, and when the economy is strained, it's not strained for the people who obviously benefited from this. It's strained for the people who have to depend on everyday services. So that economy is hurting, and that's connected to all of us. So what's the deeper pattern here that we're trying to look for? So the Vietnam War is often studied as an example of what President Eisenhower warned about in 1961: the growing influence of the military-industrial complex, the relationship between the military defense companies and government decision making. So when you talk about the military industrial complex, that's also involving companies that invest and that companies that make money from these wars, and then people invest in those companies. So this thing really bleeds over and out, and it's not just people who are immediately in weapons manufacturing. It's also people who invest in that, and also energy and infrastructure type things. So yeah, the events, the military industrial complex it's military industrial. So the industrial is supposed to be like, you would think it's kind of like private, but it's not. It's connected. It's all It's like it becomes, this thing where it is a complex type of entity, because it's tied in with military spending and investing in acts of war, usually abroad. A lot better to go and bomb some of these people over there than over here. The historic, that's what you know. And I talked about Henry Kissinger, how he was kind of like, he likes this idea about causing confusion abroad, while America or Washington's intact, and so it can kind of like take advantage of all that chaos, which reminds me again of the second law of thermodynamics. So you imagine if the second law of thermodynamics had a face, it'd be like Henry Kissinger's. That's probably a bad joke. Okay. So this historical debate, we can get into it, but So it's like so you have like things like this. So when you see like how you can't really find like one person that's controlling all this, like it's like just one person is is doing this. Um, and it's not like they're in a closed room and planning all this, but um, I could be wrong. You know, the devil could be at the helm. You know, um, I could be wrong. These people could be on the phone planning all this stuff. I would say even if you couldn't prove that, we should all collectively think that this is possible, especially if wars seem to benefit people. Because I think that wars and pandemics should benefit no one. It should benefit no one. And like you shouldn't have to spend one red nickel for medical treatment if you got COVID. And you shouldn't have to fight it, a war, which you know, is basically war is a rich man's game or a racket. It's a rich man's racket. And Smedley Butler said that. And he was a World War One decorated general. So like groups that benefited financially, you know, they did influence policy in several ways. So defense contractors and the Pentagon, these companies, they might have like directly make foreign policy, but they existed within a system that does. So the Pentagon requests weapons programs. The Congress funds them. Contractors supply jobs and economic benefits in congressional districts. And lobbyists advocated for continued defense spending. This creates what political scientists call an incentive structure. Many actors had reasons to support maintaining or expanding military commitments. President Eisenhower warned in 1961 about the growing influence of the military industrial complex, the relationship among the armed forces, defense companies, and the government institutions. Uh, so, did economic interests and reinforce military decisions in Vietnam? So, well, yeah, and the economics was only one factor, and so they could reinforce them, but remember that. Okay, the main stated reasons for Vietnam were stopping communist expansion, and I want to do a deep dive dig at that. That to me seems even that seems like suspicious of something, and like something it's like I I will want to go back to that, but that's the story. Is it's the main stated reasons for it was to stop communist expansion. Let's just leave it at that because of the domino effect in Asia. However, economic industrial interests also played a role. Defense spending created momentum. Once a large military system was built, bases existed, weapon programs depended on continued funding. Military organizations had incentives to maintain their missions. Contractors benefited from escalation. Vietnam buildup produced enormous demand. Aircraft, bombs, helicopters, electronics, communications equipment, and chemical defoliants. Companies making these products benefited financially from the continuation of the war. So you have policy pressure, the credibility argument being many officials feared that withdrawing from Vietnam would damage U.S. credibility worldwide. And so that's really powerful right there because um, we have to keep the our dollar as the as the global currency standard. Uh, like we have to be like the top dog. It seems like you always have to have a top dog, especially if you're dealing with money and trade. And I know that some of you, I might be losing some of you at the end of here, but do you know what historians say? So mainstream historians are very very convinced of something. Now I think that it's not like companies want the war, so we have a war. But I think people that own more of everything than what we do, including those companies, and the environment that allows these companies to flourish, I think they want the war to happen. And ChatGPT, if I were to use that, it ain't going to say that this is the case. But I'm not going to always, agree with that because come on, follow the money here. If nobody benefited from war, we would not be having any more wars. So, so I'm going to read to you what ChatGPT said, and I'm going to tell you what happened after that. And we're going to conclude this. It says once the Cold War system, military institutions, and political incentives and defense industries were in place, they created pressures that made escalation easier and withdrawal harder. So the relationship is less like, these people wanted war, and so war happened, like the companies. And so it said a geopolitical conflict created a military system, and that system developed economic and institutional interests that helped sustain the conflict. Now, isn't that pretty much the same thing as they wanted the war? Let me read that again. A geopolitical conflict created a military system, and that system developed economic and institutional interests that helped sustain the conflict. So you have like World War One and World War Two. Don't forget those wars. And then so like Eisenhower, that's when he was a president, right? And then after, you have Truman, and then him, then FDR and Eisenhower, all these people, they're all part of like the Cold War times, and then we kind of move into like after that, and you have like JFK and Nixon and all that, and it's like, but by that time, it's like. And Eisenhower warned us against about the military industrial complex, right? Because of this. So the economy metastasized into this one where it's dependent on the rush of war, and all these people that I mentioned, they make a lot of money. So it's like in the after that, and if you study this stuff, you might be able to trace back the idea that during the Napoleonic Wars, that wow, bankers and that and people invest in it, they can make money, and you can make money off of war because you can borrow the money, and people they could invest in the loans of that money, and then bank on the interest and all these things. I think it somehow traces back to Napoleon because he ushered us into the modern age for good and for ill. You look into Napoleon, he's a really complicated man. So I kind of got upset with what it was saying, and so I had to like put in my influence. Like, look, this geopolitical conflict creates a military system. So like that military system is created, and so that thing is now addicted to the rush of war, and so it has to sustain the conflict. So to me, it's like, yeah, they want this war, and so I kind of wanted to really rip into, okay, um, it tries to like answer it in a way that is more politically correct. That's what I think. So I just to end this, I said you tend to use too many words, you know, And I said, if nobody made money from these wars, would we have any more wars? Yes or no? It's a one word effing answer. And so you know what it answered, and this is the conclusion of my video. Thank you for watching. This is what it answered. It answered no.